Picture a cowboy dinner, and you probably imagine a dusty campfire with a rusted tin can full of baked beans. That image comes straight from the mid-20th century director who completely defined Western cinema. It turns out everything those classic movies taught you about frontier food is a complete historical fabrication. The reality of American frontier cooking was far more sophisticated than anything Hollywood ever showed us. We are going to explore the incredibly complex culinary history hiding right in the middle of Wyoming today. Let us start with the Texas rancher who designed the very first mobile frontier kitchen in 1866. He bolted a wooden pantry onto a surplus army wagon to feed cattle drivers moving herds across the dry plains. This early food truck standardized a really boring diet of salted pork belly and incredibly dense sourdough. This bland menu was purely about surviving the brutal journey rather than enjoying any sort of gastronomy. But the true food culture of this vast Western landscape had actually been thriving for countless generations. Indigenous tribes were practicing advanced culinary science long before those cattle wagons ever rolled in. Let us look past the silver screen myth and dig into what the real survivalists were actually putting on plates. The cinematic myth literally erased centuries of native diets and surprising immigrant stews from the narrative. We need to throw away the script and look at the actual archaeological evidence buried under the prairie grass. If we travel to the Black Hills region of Wyoming, we find a massive natural sinkhole that changes everything. This location functioned as a brilliant indigenous hunting tool from roughly 1500 to 1800. It was used by Plains Indian tribes to harvest bison on an absolutely massive and highly organized communal scale. They understood that surviving brutal winters required incredibly advanced meat processing and preservation. This brings us to the original superfood created by the Shoshone and Arapaho people who mastered this land. This remarkable food is a complex mixture of dried bison lean meat combined with deeply rendered animal tallow. They pounded this protein together with dried choke cherries to create an intensely nutritious travel ration. Treat this preservation method with the exact same reverence you would give to classic French culinary technique. This was not just primitive eating, but a deliberate chemical balance of proteins and vital fats to stay alive. A single pound of this indigenous mixture contained the caloric equivalent of 3 pounds of fresh bison meat. These tribes understood exactly how to extract bone marrow to create rich broths during freezing temperatures. They harvested wild turnips and prairie fireweed to add essential vitamins to their highly engineered meals. The indigenous food scene was deeply connected to the seasonal migrations of massive herds across the plains. They utilized every single organ of the animal to ensure absolute nutritional efficiency in a harsh climate. Their botanical knowledge allowed them to identify over 100 edible plants thriving in the high desert. This profound culinary foundation existed centuries before the first European fur trappers arrived on the scene. When those earliest explorers finally showed up, they quickly realized their eastern rations were totally useless. These mountain men were extreme survivalists who had to adopt indigenous diets or face certain starvation. They completely relied on native women to teach them the delicate art of processing wild game in the winter. Survival dictated a fascinating blending of cultures, rather than an immediate conquest by the new arrivals. There was a massive trading hub established in 1833, where French Canadians met local tribes. This gathering at the Green River functioned as a wild culinary exchange, where survival techniques were shared. These trappers developed a surprisingly intense culinary reliance on beaver tail as a vital source of pure fat. The famous trapper who mapped the Great Salt Lake even documented eating raw bison liver fresh from the hunt. He wrote about seasoning that warm liver with gallbladder bile for a sharp flavor that prevented terrible scurvy. This was a raw and sometimes shocking reality of wilderness caloric intake that movies just refuse to show us. These early frontiersmen were actually students of the native environment who abandoned their old food habits. They learned how to roast camas roots in underground earthen ovens to create a sweet and highly caloric paste. The trapper diet was entirely dictated by the extreme weather and the migratory patterns of the local wildlife. They traded European cast iron pots for the invaluable botanical knowledge held by the Shoshone tribal elders. This era of cultural convergence created a truly unique frontier palate built entirely on mutual survival skills. The French-Canadian influence brought a deep appreciation for rich meat stews seasoned with wild mountain herbs. They carried small brass kettles designed specifically to hang over low fires built deep in the snowy canyons. These small pots became the ultimate symbol of cross-cultural cooking during those freezing, solitary winters. A trapper might throw a tough piece of wild mutton into the boiling water, along with handfuls of bitter roots. The resulting stew provided enough internal heat and energy to keep a man walking through waist-deep powder snow. They also learned the incredible value of consuming every single drop of blood from a freshly killed animal. Blood was often mixed with crushed wild berries to create a surprisingly sweet and highly caloric winter pudding. This dietary flexibility is exactly what separated successful explorers from the ones who perished in the cold. The mountain men treated native food processing not as primitive, but as absolute cutting-edge survival science. Without this culinary education from indigenous women, the fur trade would have collapsed in its very first year. The massive rendezvous of 1833 was essentially the first major food festival of the high desert. Hundreds of tents went up as diverse groups gathered to share roasted meats and trade exotic botanical spices. It was a beautiful moment of gastronomic harmony before the massive trails tore through the delicate landscape. The trapper diet was entirely dictated by the extreme weather and the migratory patterns of the local wildlife. They traded European cast iron skillets for the invaluable botanical knowledge held by the wise tribal elders. This fascinating era of convergence proved that survival always depends on sharing knowledge over open fires. It perfectly illustrates how food can serve as a bridge between wildly different cultures in a hostile environment. But this fragile balance of culinary exchange was completely shattered when the massive pioneer wagons arrived. The landscape changed drastically when waves of settlers began crossing the continent in the 1840s. The famous migration route heading west through the South Pass brought thousands of completely unprepared families. We usually hear highly romanticized stories about this journey, but the reality was a grim struggle for calories. These pioneers had to quickly abandon their comfortable Eastern diets to survive the brutally long, dusty trail. Primary source diaries from the era describe an absolute and terrifying reliance on a dry cracker called hardtack. This incredibly dense pilot bread was practically indestructible, but offered almost zero actual nutritional value. Families would soak these rock-solid crackers in dirty river water just to make them soft enough to slowly chew. Malnutrition and rampant scurvy quickly became the greatest daily threats to these travelers crossing the plains. The romanticized heroic journey was actually a desperate daily forage for any edible plants they could scavenge. Their heavy wagons were initially packed with barrels of salted pork and heavy sacks of refined white baking flour. But the intense summer heat of the prairie quickly spoiled their precious meat and invited swarms of hungry weevils. As their familiar food supplies vanished, they were forced to look at the sparse landscape with completely new eyes. Desperate mothers learned to identify and harvest wild prairie onions growing sparsely across the arid, dry earth. This pungent allium textile provided a crucial burst of flavor and essential vitamins that literally saved lives. Indigenous peoples actively taught these starving pioneers how to dig up and safely prepare wild sago lily bulbs. The native tribes demonstrated how to roast these tiny bulbs in hot ashes to neutralize their natural bitterness. Without this direct botanical intervention from native groups, many more wagon trains would have perished completely. Families even resorted to collecting dried buffalo dung just to fuel their evening cooking fires on the plains. They boiled whatever small game they could shoot into thin broths, because roasting would waste precious animal fat. Their surviving journals reveal a profound culinary despair as they chewed on incredibly tough wild antelope meat. The brutal trail forced a total deconstruction of their civilized eating habits in favor of immediate pragmatism. A simple handful of wild berries suddenly held far more value than a trunk full of expensive imported fine china. By the time these wooden wagons finally reached the western valleys, their entire culinary identity was transformed. The harsh environment of the territory acted as a massive filter that stripped away any pretense of fancy dining. Every single calorie they consumed had to be fiercely earned through hunting or intense physical labor in the dirt. This period of mass migration left a heavy scar on the land and permanently altered the indigenous food networks. The massive herds of bison were slowly replaced by cattle as the era of the great open-range ranches began to boom. But just as the pioneer era began to settle down, a totally unexpected wave of European immigrants arrived in town. This brings us to the biggest and most fascinating twist in our entire frontier food history investigation today. We're here in the Wyoming desert. It's time to shatter that Anglo-centric cowboy myth. If you visited towns like Rock Springs in the late 19th century, you would hear a completely foreign language. A massive influx of Basque immigrants traveled from the Pyrenees Mountains straight into the deep American West. They completely bypassed the traditional cattle rancher aesthetic to establish massive sheep herding operations. These resilient shepherds brought a sophisticated European pastoral tradition into the heart of the high desert. They lived in the lonely wilderness for months at a time with only their loyal dogs and massive flocks of sheep. To survive this profound isolation, they introduced the famous Basque sheep wagons to the sprawling prairie landscape. These incredible wooden wagons predated modern food trucks by a century and featured fully functional iron stoves. Inside these tiny mobile kitchens, the herders perfected the delicate art of baking authentic Basque sourdough bread. They used heavy cast-iron Dutch ovens buried in hot coals to create loaves with incredibly thick and crusty exteriors. This specific baking technique trapped the moisture inside and kept the bread fresh during long weeks in the pasture. The aroma of baking sourdough mixed with the scent of wild sagebrush created a totally unique frontier atmosphere. They also brought their traditional recipes for deeply flavorful lamb stews simmered slowly over open wood fires. These rich stews were heavily seasoned with garlic and dried red peppers imported directly from their homeland. This level of culinary complexity stands in stark contrast to the bland beans and bacon romanticized by Hollywood. When these solitary herders finally returned to towns like Buffalo, they gathered at massive communal boarding houses. These vibrant hotels became the absolute epicenter of a thriving European gastronomic scene in the middle of nowhere. Long dining tables were packed with enormous family-style platters of roasted meats and deeply savory bean soups. The meals were always accompanied by generous pours of strong red wine, served directly from traditional glass jugs. This rich environment eventually led to the creation of their signature bitter and highly potent local mixed drink. The legendary pecan punch became the unofficial cocktail of the sheepherders, celebrating their return to civilization. This complex blend of bitter orange liqueur and brandy perfectly captured the robust spirit of the Basque immigrants. Their enduring presence totally redefines our understanding of who was actually cooking and eating in the Wild West. They proved that the American frontier was not a cultural monolith, but a vibrant tapestry of diverse global flavors. These deep historical roots continue to shape the unexpected and truly fascinating food scene found across the state. The legacy of those early indigenous preservation methods and immigrant stews has never completely faded away. We are currently witnessing a massive cultural movement aimed at fully reclaiming this authentic frontier palate. Modern chefs and native culinary leaders are actively rejecting that tired old cinematic cowboy burger stereotype. They are diving deep into the historical archives to return the state to its true hunter-gatherer gastronomic roots. This exciting renaissance is grounded in a deep respect for sustainable foraging and traditional indigenous techniques. There is a powerful modern revival happening right now on the expansive lands of the Wind River Indian Reservation. Dedicated food sovereignty activists are fighting hard to bring back the traditional methods of bison harvesting. They are successfully cultivating indigenous heirloom crops that have completely adapted to the arid local climate. This crucial movement is about restoring health and deep cultural pride through the power of ancestral nutrition. By returning to these pre-Columbian diets, they are proving that true culinary resilience never actually disappeared. This deep historical reverence is also finding its way into the incredibly vibrant high-end restaurant scene today. Contemporary chefs are heavily utilizing native Rocky Mountain sagebrush to smoke their locally harvested wild game. They are serving beautifully plated dishes of wild elk that honor the raw survivalist roots of the early trappers. You can now find menus featuring delicate trout cured with the exact same prairie onions that saved the pioneers. These innovative kitchens are treating local botanical ingredients with the utmost respect and rigorous scientific care. It is a stunning culinary evolution that proves the original diets of the frontier have finally come full circle. The complex flavors that sustained the Shoshone and nourished the Basque herders are celebrated once again today. We can clearly see that the real story of this landscape was never about solitary men eating beans out of tin cans. It has always been a profound story about human adaptability and the incredible power of cross-cultural connection. Food has historically served as the ultimate survival tool in an environment that heavily punishes the unprepared. Every single preserved berry and slow-cooked stew represents a quiet victory against the brutally harsh wilderness. By stripping away the Hollywood illusions, we uncover a food culture that is deeply sophisticated and vastly diverse. The true flavor of the American West is built on a foundation of native brilliance and surprising global migration. It is a rich and constantly evolving narrative that deserves to be studied with genuine intellectual curiosity. So the next time you watch a classic Western movie, pay close attention to what they are carefully leaving off the plate. Remember the massive bison jumps and the highly engineered pemmican that sustained entire native civilizations? Think about the exhausted pioneer families desperately foraging for tiny lily bulbs just to survive another hot day. Raise a glass to the lonely sheepherders baking incredible sourdough bread in the absolute middle of a dusty nowhere. The real culinary history of Wyoming proves that reality is always infinitely more delicious than a Hollywood script. This fascinating journey through time shows us exactly how human beings master their environment through their food. We will continue to dig up these buried culinary secrets and explore the complex origins of the meals we eat today. Stay profoundly curious about the hidden past, because the true history of our food is always waiting to be uncovered.